This presentation that I'm going to give today is the chapter 1 of my book. My book is called Systemic Corruption, Constitutional Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic. And I basically theorize the crisis of democracy from a structural perspective. Okay? So I begin this presentation from the premise that liberal democracy, as any other political regime throughout history, is flawed and perfectible, a product of fallible human thinking. Of the many deficiencies of our current regime form, perhaps the most problematic one is corruption. Yes. So according to Transparency International, corruption is a serious problem. In 2016, only 2 countries, Denmark and New Zealand, out of 176 states surveyed scored above percentile 90, which is equivalent to an A in political cleanliness. And over 2/3 score below 50%, which indicates that the majority of representative governments suffer from endemic corruption, a kind of systemic grand corruption that violates human rights, prevents sustainable development, and fuels social exclusion, according to Transparency International. Even if the Corruption Perception Index attempts to explicitly account for systemic corruption, as opposed to mere cash for votes, quid pro quo corruption, the current definition of political corruption does not yet allow for an accurate measurement of its structural layer because it remains blind to the role procedures and political institutions play in fostering corruption through their normal functioning. I argue that we are working with an imperfect, reductionist explanation of political corruption that even if it allows for quantitative research and generalizations based on discrete observable variables, it does not capture the broader, more intractable and pernicious form of systemic corruption that ancients and modern political thinkers wanted to avoid. The predominant definition of corruption as illegal actions concerning public officials is narrower and departs in significant ways from the meaning that was attached to corruption in earlier periods of the Western thought. Our current understanding of political corruption is positivist and individualist, which has served well the research model that has become hegemonic in the social sciences since the 1990s, which demands the development of concepts that could be easily measured and plugged into large N models. Corruption has been conveniently reduced to its most visible and clear expressions: illegal acts involving public officials, for example, bribery, fraud, and nepotism. But even if the reduction of political corruption to a discrete set of expressions serves the reliable measurement of the phenomena, this account can only be partial, since it is clear that political corruption is a slow-moving process where meaningful change in the independent variable occurs only over the long run, tending then in practice to fall off the radar within this type of quantitative methodology. Despite a recent renewed empirical interest on systemic corruption and how to deal with it, the concept is yet to be adequately defined and understood. The bulk of research done on corruption is policy-oriented, especially in the developing world. And I quote from the Corruption Index. Corruption is thus presented as if it were a matter of misconduct from the part of public officials who are seen, especially in poor countries, as pursuing their own private interests and likely to act corruptly in return for money and other favors, thereby undermining economic development. In conformity with this individualist model that undergirds the current conception of corruption, but acknowledging the limitations of analyzing corruption only through its narrow definition, the different institutions aimed at combating corruption have relied on individuals' perception of corruption as a way to complement the tallying of individual illegal acts as a proxy for the rate of corruption in the society. This is, of course, very problematic. If there is no working definition of corruption beyond the legal, on what evidence are respondents of these surveys basing their perceptions? Corruption conceived in this way is guilty of moral relativism and legal positivism, because it does not consider an independent standard to judge the law and thus could even end up legalizing the most prominent means of corruption. For example, campaign finance and donations and lobby, which at the beginning of the 20th century were illegal. In our current juridical conception of corruption, for example, there's no way to account for legal corruption, for laws and policies that promote the interests of a few against the common good, what the ancients would understand as the gradual decay of good government. The few attempts at engaging with the concept at a theoretical level fall short from fully conceiving the fundamentally systemic nature of political corruption or adequately grounding it on intellectual history. I contribute to this emerging theoretical literature by providing a contextualized theoretical analysis of a type of political corruption that seems a systemic feature of all constitutional popular government. Systemic corruption, which encompasses structural forms of corruption, such as legal and individual and institutional corruption, is not only different from the actor-based meaning of the term, the bending and breaking of the law by a clan or a class for their own benefit, or the buying of political influence by private interest, but also differs from the definitions of corruption as the undermining of the rule of law. Systemic corruption is a term that seems to directly address the nature of the superstructure itself, and not the manipulation or the dismantling of such structure that is seen as a normative ground for neutrality. I divide this exploration in three parts. In the first section, I begin with an analysis of the ancient Greek concept of corruption in pre-Socratic thought, and then focus on Plato and Aristotle in the context of the consolidated Athenian democratic regime of the 4th century BC, and on Polybius, who argued, based on the structure of the popular Roman Republic of the 2nd century BC, that a mixed constitution was necessary to escape the cycle of corruption. In the second section, I provide an in-depth analysis of Machiavelli's understanding of corruption in Republican Florence as a systemic problem rooted on laws, procedures, and institutions. I conclude this theoretical exposition by proposing to embrace Machiavellian approach to corruption, and therefore to understand it systemically, as determined by the constitution of the state, which forces us not only to measure corruption at the level of rules, procedures, and institutions and their outcomes, but also to see it as an intrinsically connected to the current drift into increasingly oligarchic systems of rule in the majority of countries around the world. Finally, I will briefly analyze the case of Chile and argue that the ongoing popular uprising demonstrate that despite its excellent economic numbers and low degrees of corruption, its neoliberal economic and legal structure has allowed for a rapid oligarchization of power, systemic corruption, and pervasive oligarchic domination. Even though we associate corruption with illegal action, the etymological origin of the word has a far more complex meaning. The Greek ancestors of the word corruption has been traced to Torah, which meant, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but which meant destruction, decay, and passing away, as correlative to Genesis, the beginning of a process. While in early pre-Socratic texts, the word was used only to denote the moral degradation of women and youth and the ruining of crops due to bad weather, the concept appears to acquire a decisively abstract meaning in 6th century BC. The theoretical conception of Torah was first developed, according to Aristotle, by Thales of Miletus, the founder of the school of philosophy that identifies unchangeable elements in nature, principles that are neither generated nor destroyed, but persistent eternally. The physicists, as he called them, attempted to understand how could plurality in the cosmos be generated from matter as a single underlying substance. Anaximander argued matter was governed by a diversifying antithesis, in which matter is constantly being generated through condensation and rarefaction, and that Torah was a natural process through which things return to the original indefinite principle. Empedocles and Anaxagoras assign a direction to this poietic process of generation. While Empedocles' generation of matter was circular, always coming back to its starting point, for Anaxagoras, the movement was spiral, never repeating itself. The concept of corruption acquired a political meaning when it was first attached to the constitution of the state by Plato, and then further analyzed by Aristotle in the Politics. I would argue both authors developed their conceptions of corruption responding to their own political context, and thus we should analyze their ideas responding to their own sociopolitical context of political corruption in diminished post-imperial Athens. Through a contextual analysis of their ideas, in what follows I show that while in Plato for the source of corruption in democracy was constitutive principle of liberty, which gradually eroded hierarchies and rule, for Aristotle, corruption sprang from the full realization of the principle of equal share in government. Since the series of constitutional reforms began by Cleisthenes in the 6th century BC, based on the principle of isonomia, right up to Pericles' pro-democratic policies, the popular sector in ancient Athens was gradually empowered until acquiring preeminence. By the 4th century, almost all magistrates were selected by lottery from a broad pool of citizens who enjoyed isegoria, the equal right to speak to the assembly, and were paid by the state to exercise political power. The empowerment of non-elite citizens came hand in hand with Athens' increased naval power and state revenue, and with the diminishing of the elite's institutional power. While during Athens' golden years, the increased participation of the masses in political power was financed through colonial tributes and high production of state silver mines, after Athens lost its empire and the production of mines began to decrease, equal share in government was mostly financed through indirect taxation of the leisure classes, whose political influence decreased especially after the aristocratic Areopagus was stripped from its veto power. An Athenian citizen of high status, Plato came out of age in the midst of the Peloponnesian War, in which Athens was ultimately defeated, and a long time brewing oligarchic coup. After the restoration of democracy shortly after, Plato witnessed the execution of his mentor, Socrates, condemned to death by the Athenian assembly for corrupting the youth and religion. Pay for assembly goers and jurors, and the establishment of the nomothetai selected by lot, had effectively made the popular sectors the judges of behavior and the interpreters of law. And in Plato's eyes, the death of Socrates came to evidence the hubris the multitude was capable of when drunk with liberty. Democratia was certainly not a perfect form of government, and its consolidation or radicalization was seen by Plato as only one more phase in the relentless decay of political organizations. In the Republic, he envisioned the best form of government as that of the philosopher kings, an aristocracy of guardians of virtue who are able to organize society in the best way possible because they lack a stake on it. Guardians would live communally, separated from other classes and barred from owning property. However, even this seemingly perfect constitution maintained the most virtuous elite would not be able to escape corruption because, as Plato says, Torah awaits everything that has come to be, and even a foundation of this kind will not survive for the whole of time. Even if in later writings, Plato further explored Torah only as a process of degradation that is proper to physis, since there is no strict separation between the natural and the political in his thought, this process of decay would also rule the political realm created by men. In Timaeus, Plato puts forward a basic intuition about the decay of bodies, which would later be validated by the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics, as revealing an inherent process of degradation through the transfer of energy. What Plato depicts as an extremely difficult process to preserve the nature of things is what the second law explains as the inevitable transfer of heat energy and the resulting increase of entropy, disorder, in closed systems. Degradation occurs because internal energy is transferred within different bodies in a given system, and in this inevitable transfer process, energy is transformed and wasted until the process ends at a certain temperature in which there is no difference of heat between the inside and the outside of the body. The only way to reverse this process of decay is by applying work through the external energy source. So if the system is, for instance, an ice cube with tight molecules, the natural process, according to the second law, would be for these molecules to move more and more, and for the energy to be transferred from the warmer parts to the colder ones, until the molecules have separated and spread out, and the cube has completely melted. The only way to preserve the ice cube is to artificially keep the molecules tight by creating an environment below freezing level through the use of external energy, or what is called work. The same as an ice cube will inevitably melt at room temperature, and cease to be an ice cube and become water, the constitution of a given state would be completely ruined by the entropy inevitably produced by its normal functioning and turn into a different political order. From Callipolis' utopian aristocracy, political forms would gradually degrade, first into the lesser form of timocracy, the regime by the honorable, then into oligarchy, the rule by the wealthy, then into democracy, based on the equal sharing political power and liberty, and finally into tyranny, the worst form of government that imposes the harshest and most complete slavery. Tyranny is for him an order that is complete opposite of the virtuous aristocracy of the guardians, in which all citizens are virtuous and contribute in their particular roles to the harmony of the polis. Tyranny is for Plato anarchy, the transgression of natural hierarchy and the absence of rule. When developing his idea of political decay, Plato's target was a democracy of his own time. While he recognizes that liberty is the principle of democracy, he argues that liberty is itself a liability, a source of disorder, because it results in individuals living according, and I quote, to their own constitution, having their own rules, pursuing only their own interests, and respecting no other authority but their own will. For Plato, corruption in a democracy would be the inevitable result of an equal distribution of liberty, which allows for the pursuit of individual interest and the constant increase of entropy within the constitutional framework. In other words, liberty as constitutive to democracy is for Plato a liability that contaminates the public realm, weakening the possibility of arche and virtue, permanently undermining hierarchies, tradition, and rules, and making government prone to hubris and destined to injustice and tyranny. Departing from Plato's linear pattern of corruption as a gradual process of decay from aristocracy to tyranny, Aristotle argues for a typology of regimes based on the fundamental diversifying antitheses of Genesis and Torah that exists in everything. And I quote, "Since all things that come into existence in the course of nature are either opposites themselves or are compounded of opposites, corruption can be analyzed as a movement along the determined lines between the terms of contrast. Or, if we start from one intermediate state, the movement towards one of its extremes." On this premise of the generative nature of opposites, Aristotle bases one of his most original observations, with far-reaching political implications, that change comes about through the corruption of nature, that change, metabole, is primarily a passing away. Torah, therefore, is an inevitable, natural force deriving change in the physical world, working within bounded spheres determined by the opposition implied in the coming into being of a thing. Each thing has a principle, a mixture of them, and it is its relation what brings about corruption. Everything begins to corrupt the moment it is fully realized, and metabole occurs when the realization is fully negated. Since all things arose out of what existed, and so must be there already, according to Aristotle, every constitution would have a constitutive principle that would become fully realized, enabling its demise. The degree of corruption of constitutions would relate to the movement within these extremes. Following this idea, Aristotle conceived of three good constitutions: monarchy, aristocracy, and politeia, based on the nature of the sovereign, one, few, or many, and their corresponding and their final cause, ruling for the common interest or for eudaimonia, happiness, and their corresponding perverted forms brought about by corruption, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, aimed not at advancing the common good, but at satisfying the personal interests of the rulers. There is much debate about the fundamental feature of the ideal politeia in Aristotle's thought. While some define politeia as a combination of democracy and oligarchy, and thus a mixed regime in which the interest of the few and the many keep each other in check, others emphasize its constitutional character, giving that the ultimate authority would reside on fundamental law and not on the will of the majority. I would argue these interpretations are not mutually exclusive. As Aristotle described on the Constitution of Athens and the Politics, Athenian democracy during his time corresponded to the most extreme and corrupt form of democracy, the absolute rule of the many for their own benefit. In his classification of regimes, he identified 4 types of democracy based on the social basis of the sovereign, the degree of participation in government, and the supremacy of the law. The first 3 types of democracy, which I label here light democracy, in which the masses share equally in constitutional rights but are unable, due to material constraints, to actually exercise their sovereign power, the rule of law is supreme, and thus Aristotle considers them as good constitutional forms of government. The 4th type of democracy, however, which he identifies with the Athenian democracy of his time, is inherently corrupt, since the mass of the poor, thanks to a system of state payment for attending the assembly, are the sovereign power instead of the law. This extreme form of democracy is brought about by leaders of the demagogue type who arrive precisely because decrees and not laws are sovereign, enabling the transformation of the sovereign demos into a type of despotic autocrat. This form of government has no proper constitution, since the people are sovereign in all matters, and is easily influenced by demagogues who have no official position other than the one conferred by the contingent favor of the masses. Demagogues educate the poor on how to advance their own interests, increase their power, and thus are the agents of corruption, enabling interest to be made into law. The full realization of equal share in government appears then to inevitably produce regime change, since such a regime in which everything is managed merely by decrees is not even a democracy, according to Aristotle. In Aristotle's particular historical account of Athens' history, which I don't abide by completely, demagoguery plagued the state since the rise of Pericles, who not only took powers away from the Areopagites, but also impelled the state toward naval power, and as a result of this power, it befell that the masses took confidence and began in greater degree to draw the whole constitution into their own hands. Thus, departing from Thucydides' account of Athenian history, which puts total control of government in the masses after Pericles' death in 429 BC, Aristotle argues that the extreme form of democracy began 3 decades earlier with a reform of the Areopagus, which enabled a regime change. While the absolute liberty the assembly gained after the last aristocratic constraints were removed would mark the beginning of regime change, the complete realization of democracy occurs only when the principle of equal access to political power is fully applied, with the payment of people to go to the assembly. Even though a corrupt state implies for Aristotle a loss of virtue, both by rulers and common citizens, he is very clear that virtue depends on the appropriate legal structure to thrive. Because virtue is not natural to human beings, but needs to be acquired by habit and action. The degree of virtue and corruption in the polis is determined by the law and its effects on the members of the state. In Aristotle's account, good character, desire in accordance with good reason, cannot exist without habituation. Moral virtue is difficult to acquire because it is concerned with pleasures and pains, the disciplines of the appetites and the internalization of social norms. Therefore, the right habituation must be learned from others and exercised constantly to create a sort of second moral nature. At the political level, it is the legislator who, grasping the principle of the common good, creates a constitution that can make the citizens good by habituating them. Good laws make good citizens by providing them with the principles of virtuous action. This, the form to which they should shape their character, the legal framework materializes the universal principle, guiding action toward the common good, providing both the limits and the opportunities to engage in virtuous action. The same can be said for corrupt action, preferring individual or sexual interest against that of the polis, as being enabled by the legal structure, with the crucial difference that corruption is a natural tendency that will exist regardless of laws. Therefore, each regime needs to habituate their citizens appropriately through good laws aimed at fostering moral and civic virtue against relentless, unavoidable corruption. If they fail to do this and laws become inadequate, allowing and even fostering greed and the thirst for domination in the sovereign, citizens become habituated in that way, and the polis inevitably becomes a corrupt state. Democracy as absolute, unconstrained rule by the people, a form of government effectively lacking a constitution as higher law, is thus for Aristotle inherently corrupt. Despite their difference of constitutions, both Plato and Aristotle agree that political corruption occur in pure regimes due to a loss of virtue in the sovereign body when personal interests take place of the common good and the final cause of government. If viewed from the second law of thermodynamics, the process of political corruption as Torah could be conceived as the natural increase of entropy generated by the pursuit of individual or sectional interest against the common good within a given constitutional framework. This loss of virtue in the ruling body would mark the beginning of the end of a given good constitution, if no constant or episodic external work is applied to it to counteract the thrust of actions aimed at the satisfaction of partial interest. Moreover, because corruption and the increase of entropy inevitably produce a change of nature, and thus an effective modification of the constitution of the state, the quest for virtue is connected to the idea of preservation against corruption. Aristotle aims at counteracting corruption by proposing as the best form of government one based on a mixture of natures and principles, in which both the few and the many share in government and the majority of citizens are part of the middle classes. Aristotle's politeia is a constitutional direct democracy in which the masses govern the state with a view to the common interest, and the masses are composed mainly of the middle classes, who possess moderate and adequate property. This best practicable constitution, an intermediate regime between the extremes of oligarchy and democracy, would successfully combine qualifications of wealth and legal equality because the middle classes, a majority, would effectively control government. Being a mixture of constitutions and thus in an intermediate position, one could argue that following Aristotle's ideas on corruption, the politeia as an ideal type would become corrupt by tending either to oligarchy or democracy. However, the same as Plato, he only entertains a corrupting tendency towards democracy. Even if, from his ideas of the nature of things, it is clear that things that are in the intermediate positions inevitably drift toward either of the extremes. The same as a politeia would suffer metabole if the principle of equal sharing government is fully realized, if the principle of oligarchy, inequality based on wealth, status, or knowledge, becomes predominant and driven to its extreme, with a handful of people owning most of the property, the politeia would inevitably undergo a regime change into an oligarchy, a regime analogous to the last form of democracy in which the sovereign is unbound to seek its own advantage, closely akin to the personal rule of a monarch. Extending Aristotle's taxonomy of good and deviant constitutions and combining it with Empedocles' cosmological theory of cyclical change, the Greek historian Polybius, who documented the rise of the Roman Republic, articulated a cycle of political revolution, the course appointed by nature, in which constitutions change, disappear, and finally return to the point from which they started. According to his anacyclosis, pure regimes, starting from the best one, kinship, then aristocracy, and then finally democracy, are bound to degenerate into their deviant forms until the tyranny of the many establishes the rules of violence, and the people, and I quote, degenerate and again into perfect savages and find once more a master and a monarch. For Polybius, corruption is inevitable in pure regime forms, and I quote, just as rust in the case of iron and woodworms and shipworms in the case of timber are inbred pests, and their substances, even though they escape all external injury, fall a prey to the evils engendered in them. So each constitution has a vice engendered in it and inseparable from it. Following Aristotle, he argues only mixture could stave off corruption. However, instead of combining the worst two regimes types as Aristotle did, following the example of Lycurgus, Polybius argues we must regard as the best constitution a combination of the three best forms of government: kinship, aristocracy, and democracy, which he conceives as a form of limited government. While the king's actions were bounded by rational principles, and aristocratic rule was limited by the morality and wisdom of the few selected to administrate public affairs, democracy was the regime in which majority decision prevailed within a traditional framework of popular obedience to the decrees of religion, elders, and civil laws. The Roman constitution was of a mixed nature because it institutionalized these three sources of authority, which shared in the control of the Roman state. While the consuls exercised authority in Rome over all public affairs, The Senate exerted control over the republic finances and public works, in addition to dispatching embassies and declaring war and giving advice to magistrates. The people, on the other hand, had the right to confer honors and inflict punishment, especially on individuals who had held public office, and the power of approving or rejecting laws and ratifying issues related to war and peace. The three forms of authority and institutional power were, moreover, in permanent dynamic balance in a system in which none of the principles should grow unduly and be perverted into its allied evil, but that the force of each being neutralized by that of the others, neither of them should prevail and outbalance another. Corruption in the mixed regime, which Polybius associates to the Roman Republic, is not the full realization of an antithesis, but the result of an imbalance of political power in the Constitution, which allows for the domination of one of the principles over the others. However, Polybius does not acknowledge the corruption slowly unraveling at the moment he was writing the histories. Even if by the late Republic the plebeian tribunate appeared as a strong institution able not only to give protection to individuals against the consuls, but also to obstruct the Senate and initiate legislation, it was unable to ultimately thwart the overgrowth of power of the nobility. The Republic kept progressively drifting into oligarchy, mainly due to the co-optation of tribunes into patrician classes and the Senate's disregard of the legislative authority of the plebeian council. The tumults that resulted from the disregard of plebeian authority plagued the late Roman Republic and served as a catalyst for regime change and the birth of imperial authority. The translation of Torah into the Latin root corruptus kept its abstract meaning of destruction and decay at the systemic level, alongside a substantive moral meaning related to the individual political actions, to bribe, falsify, seduce, or pervert. It was mainly Cicero who used the word corruptus in a political sense to refer to the decay of mores and the depravity of evil custom as the culprit of the decline of Rome. Following closely Plato's analysis of the corruption of democracy, Cicero blames the decay of the Republic to the success of the extreme liberty that inevitably reaches everything in a commonwealth in which everyone is free and all sense of shame is lost. This individual moral meaning of corruption was further developed during medieval times, in which the sinful nature of human beings took center stage. Following closely the Ciceronian legacy, Augustine famously argued all earthly governments are inherently corrupt, because rooted in the original sin, and veered the focus of analysis to civic stability as the highest attainable political good. This approach spawned more than 10 centuries of mirrors of princes texts, centered on the moral virtue of rulers as a form of achieving stability and good rule. After the reintroduction of Aristotle to political philosophy in the 13th century, political analysis of virtue and corruption shifted once more from the moral qualities of individual rulers toward the institutional merits of political regimes. Within scholastic thought, Aquinas fused moral values to the Aristotelian conception of right reason, producing a new political meaning of virtue and corruption associated with the res publica Christiana. Political corruption was once again associated with the preference for individual interests against the common good, but remained pegged to the Christian morality and the Augustinian framework that conceived of civic stability as the highest political good and of civil discord a sign of corruption. As Quentin Skinner shows, scholastic thought had a significant impact on the new humanist strand that developed in early Quattrocento Florence, which attempted to defend the Republic experiment in scholastic terms, based primarily in virtue ethics. It is this Ciceronian scholastic humanistic legacy, according to which political corruption is reduced to individuals' vicious actions, that our current juridical conception of corruption is grounded. A crucial challenge to the classicist view of political corruption, centered on the individual virtue, came from a civic strand of humanist thinkers from the Italian city-states being threatened by papacy and empire in the 14th century and 15th centuries. Reintroducing ancient Roman political values, this humanist tradition brought to the fore the political concept of liberty as connected to civic virtue and good popular government, and put corruption as an evil in need of permanent contention in the proposed constitutional frameworks. Even if Machiavelli was not the first thinker of the Renaissance to focus on the role of corruption in politics, he reveals a heightened awareness of the problem and devotes an unprecedented amount of attention to the investigation of its causes. By challenging humanist virtues ethics and their support for the rule of the educated elites as the best form of government, Machiavelli proposes a structural understanding of corruption that puts the burden of good government on institutions, laws, and procedures. While virtue ethics humanists saw virtue in the ruling class as the key to good government, for Machiavelli, republican liberty was the result of good laws, which are themselves the product of the institutional conflict between the few and the many. Machiavelli's preoccupation with political corruption was embedded in the extraordinary democratic experiment of the Republic of Florence, which began in 1494 with the establishment of the Great Council, a form of direct democracy that allowed for the extensive participation of citizens in legislative, electoral, and judicial authority within the Republic. Despite the extensive powers of the council, the Republic remained effectively dependent on the financial oligarchy due to its reliance on mercenary armies that were paid by an extraordinary system of public debt. According to Jérémie Barthas, as Secretary and Second Chancellor of the Republic, Machiavelli saw as his central task to liberate the Republic from the grip of the financial oligarchy. We will call today the financial military complex. It has a grip on the state. Through the introduction of a project of mass conscription, an ordinary and socialized mode of defense that would establish the autonomy of the Republic of Florence from the financial power of the Grandi. I argue Machiavelli's conception of power and thus his constitutional proposals conception of corruption needs to be understood as connected to this constant threat of oligarchy. And thus, his constitutional proposal should be analyzed as socialized modes of defense against the relentless force of corruption. So in his analysis of corruption, Machiavelli distinguishes three things: the matter, the form, and the method. The matter are the citizens of any republic. The form are the laws and the institutions. And the methods are the procedures through which power is allocated. Even though he, of course, recognizes that gifts and promises are frequent forms of corruption of individuals, and agrees with Cicero that a corrupt government necessarily entails corrupt customs, he pegs the corruption to the system, to the Republican constitutional structure. So for Machiavelli, the corruption process does not begin in the matter, so in individuals, because they are governed by unavoidable egoistic tendencies that cannot be avoided, right? So the corruption begins in the form, restraining individual interests, and in the methods by which rulers are selected. Individual interest is a force permanently trying to unduly influence government, but only succeeding and thus effectively corrupting the Republic if laws and methods are flawed and liberty's scaffolding is already being slowly dismantled from within. And I quote, "An evil-disposed citizen cannot affect any changes for the worse in a republic unless it is already corrupt." So for Machiavelli, good laws promote civic virtue. Yes, promote civic virtue, and bad laws enable corruption. So throughout his writings, he identifies two types of corrupting norms. One is license, so moral license, and the others are laws that increase socio-economic inequality. Referring to the case of Scipio, Machiavelli makes the case that norms allowing for increased license bring ruin even to the most glorious men and institutions. Scipio was called the corrupter of the Roman soldiery because he was too lenient and gave his soldiers more license than it was consistent with military discipline, which encouraged them to become unruly. And the same as good disciplined soldiers become bad and rowdy through the lifting of restraints to their behavior, the general corruption of mortals is allowed to begin when the laws that restrain the citizens were often altered, such as the law relating to adultery, the sumptuary laws, that in relation to ambition, and many others, which were changed according to the citizens from one day to another when they became corrupt. So in addition to promoting moral license and undermining virtue, laws play a key role in allowing for inequality, which ultimately makes the protection of liberty and the Republican project impossible. According to Machiavelli, because republics need relative equality to exist, so great inequality produces princedom, relative equality produces republics. If If laws allows for accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few and the destitution of the majority, the gradual transition from good government into a corrupt one is inevitable. Because Machiavelli sees the republic as a type of political organization that is inherently tied to the socio-economic structure of society, republican liberty demands the citizens live in relative equality, in a correspondence based on individual labor and frugality, says Machiavelli. For Machiavelli, lords, and I quote, who without working live in luxury on the returns from their landed possessions, so the rentier class, are dangerous for any republic. They are the beginners of corruption and the cause of all evil. But even if Machiavelli strongly denounces wealthy elites and their great influence as the cause of states being reduced to servitude, he also acknowledges that a republic that has no distinguished citizens cannot be well governed. So killing them is not the answer. And that it is the job of the institutions of the state to adequately channel individual interests for the benefit of the republic. Bad laws enable undue influence on government from fatal families and the division of society into factions that will strive by every means of corruption to secure friends and supporters in order to satisfy their interests, he says. Good laws, on the other hand, establish necessity and duty to create virtuous citizens and make sure the influence of wealth, and I quote, is kept within proper limits by prohibiting the legal ability to command enormous fortunes, castles, and subjects. Anti-corruption laws putting limits to the command of wealth and patronage are thus essential to preserve a good constitutional form. Today, we could talk about a wealth tax that we have been talking in the US. So that kinds of laws would actually allow for corruption to be kept within bounds. Even though in Machiavelli's theory fundamental laws made good citizens by establishing appropriate limits, rights and duties, it is for him on the methods where the burden of the maintenance of the constitution and the virtue of the citizens appears to be finally placed. Because human affairs are in constant flux and the matter is not homogeneous but composed of two opposing humors, he says the desire to oppress and the desire to be left alone. There is a dynamic relation between form and matter, laws and men. Therefore, the methods regulating the creation of law and the exercise of power, the procedures allowing for the institutional balance between the elite and the people are crucial. Good laws are not enough to shape good citizens and keep corruption at bay. An appropriate method of allocating political power and the management of state rule, good procedures aimed at non-domination, is also necessary. It is at this point in his analysis that Machiavelli criticizes as vehicles for corruption what are the two most fundamental elements of our current liberal representative systems, elections and freedom of speech. Using as an example the Roman Republic, Machiavelli describes how corruption derived from inequality at the political level ultimately undermined the constitutional order. The procedure for the selection of magistrates based on voluntary candidacy and the right to propose legislation and speak in the assembly, even though were in the beginning good, allowing for the most able to become magistrates, and for each one who thinks of something of benefit to the republic to have the right to propose it, were the means through which corruption crept in to the political system, undermining liberty. And I quote, "Such a basic costume became bad because only the powerful proposed laws, not for the common liberty, but for their own power, and for fear of such men, no one dared to speak against those laws. Thus the people were either deceived or forced into decreeing their own ruin." While the procedure of election based on political equality to compete for office brought corruption through the self-selection of candidates, the right to speak in the assembly, what for the Athenian democracy constituted the fundamental principle of isegoria, became the vehicle through which the powerful imposed their values and ideas on the many, forcing their consent. The rights to election and political speech, at least as they were originally conceived, were thus the mediums through which corruption through hegemony was imposed, creating a state in which the many chose and decreed their own ruin, undermined their actual power, and destroyed the republic. Consequently, for Machiavelli, it is when the grandi dominate the popolo based on their own forced consent by creating through deed and speech a narrative of their worldview which is gradually accepted as legitimate, that the matter is corrupted and laws are not enough to maintain liberty. You would say today that that hegemony is neoliberalism. We have been fed and we buy into it. In other words, when socioeconomic inequalities permeate the political process and laws are consistently being made or not approved for the interest of the few, amidst generalized complacency, universal corruption ends up transforming the republic into a tyrannical government. This gradual corruption of the republic into oligarchy happens then not despite institutions and procedures, but enabled by them, through them. At least two lessons are to be learned from Machiavelli's discoveries in the example of the ancients. That neither the matter or the form are inherently virtues, so no, either constitutions or procedures, or individuals, and that even if the matter has been made good through the original virtuous form, a good constitution, the form is not enough to keep citizens good when corruption has been introduced through legitimate political methods and has become pervasive. Moreover, when the matter is corrupt, the form and the methods do nothing more than fostering corruption, and republics increasingly drift into an oligarchy of consent through the natural functioning of its methods. So today, our understanding of free speech and media, fake news, all what is happening, in addition to elections and campaign finance, will be the mediums, the vehicles through which our republic is corrupting from within. This would be the lesson from Machiavelli. So, how do we understand political corruption today based on this ancient wisdom? So, in his essay analyzing the problems associated with developing an encompassing definition of political corruption, Mark Philp argued that the main challenge any such definition encounters is that it presupposes a notion of an ideal, uncorrupted form of political rule. So what is being corrupted today? Liberal democracy. This is the answer. But we really don't know what we understand by liberal democracy. If democracy should be understood as a procedural, deliberative, or radical political form, is in itself a controversial issue. I do not wish to contribute to this debate here, but simply to identify a minimal condition of good popular government. Following Aristotle's logic, representative government could be conceived both as a compound ideal type defined by its term of contrast and as an intermediate political regime that moves towards one of its extremes. Being a hybrid regime composed of the principles of democracy and liberalism, a minimal definition of an ideal liberal democracy would be the regime that fully realizes its democratic and liberal ends, to accurately represent the interests of the majority within the limits imposed by individual rights and separation of powers. The complete opposite of this type would be an unrepresentative illiberal government in which neither the interests of the majority nor the basic norms are respected. This corrupt government would fall within the ancient definition of tyranny, in which those in power benefit themselves without any limitations on their will but their own power of coercion. We will think about a dictatorship now. From the perspective not of principles, but of the regime ruling element, so who actually holds the power, given that representative a government is factually a collection of individuals elected by citizens to make law and policy decisions, this minimalist conception of an ideal type of liberal democracy would be akin to a constitutional elected aristocracy, a government by the few, the best, the wisest, the most representative, chosen by the majority to rule within established constitutional limitations. Seen through a Republican lens, the corrupt form that completely negates liberal democracy would be then an illiberal oligarchy, a government by the few for the benefit of the few without constitutional constraints. Even if everyone would agree that a government that does not represent the majority and does not respect rights is no longer a democracy, this analysis is not helpful for developing a definition of systemic corruption, which thrives within highly guarded constitutional frameworks. So we're here, systemic corruption is not an outright violation of the structure, but it's actually the undermining from within. If we conceive this ideal type as an intermediate regime that corrupts by moving towards either of its extremes, liberal democracy would corrupt by either becoming unrepresentative of the majority or illiberal, depending on what principle is being undermined or realized. Therefore, a liberal democracy would corrupt and become either an oligarchic democracy, a non-representative liberal government in which individual rights and separation of powers are upheld, but the interests of the majority are consistently not represented, or a populist democracy, a representative government in which the majority's interests consistently trump the right of minorities. Both oligarchic democracy and populist democracy are still technically democracies in which free and fair elections and formal individual rights are protected. Liberal democracy will be completely negated with governments in which human rights of minorities are systematically violated, a totalitarian democracy and illiberal oligarchy. Even if certainly there have been examples of these four corrupt forms of government, illiberal oligarchy, totalitarian democracy, populist democracy, and oligarchic democracy, the type of systemic corruption Republican thinkers were mostly concerned about, and that is ubiquitous today, is the gradual decay of representativeness and the increasing oligarchization of government and society within a general respect for the rule of law. A concept of systemic corruption thus needs to be connected to increasing socioeconomic inequality, which enables inequality of political influence and the drift into oligarchic democracy, a regime in which citizens empower through their ballots those who enable their own dispossession and oppression. Perhaps the first contour we need to draw to accurately define systemic corruption is its political nature. Currently, political corruption relates to fraudulent action involving public office, which puts the focus on the corrupt nexus between public and private. Given the complex relation between corruption and the law, a definition that focuses mainly on the agents of corruption and their exchanges seems inappropriate to conceptualize the systemic layer of political corruption. The conception of institutional corruption, even if a step in the right direction, away from the mainly juridical individual conception, is also unable to appropriately track the oligarchic component of systemic corruption, given its ungrounded functionalism that avoids substantive definitions of primary purposes. So institutional corruption refers to the corruption within a certain institution, but sometimes that institution is so ineffective that the corruption within it, for example, clientelism, would allow for the institution to work better. So therefore, we cannot just understand corruption in the institutional manner, but it has to be in the macro. Okay? I would argue systemic corruption in liberal democracies should be understood as a long-term, slow-moving process of oligarchization of society's political structure, and thus it should be analyzed at the macro level. Instead of looking at the inputs of political corruption, undue influence, which is hard to prove and thus prosecute, we should focus rather on these outputs as anything pertaining to rules, procedures, and institutions that has the effect of benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the majority. We need to move away from intention and towards the consequences of political corruption to identify and measure its structural character. Following the ancients' insights on systemic corruption as an inevitable and progressive process, the first major implication of this alternative meaning of political corruption would be that our liberal democracies would not be exempt from this degenerative movement because of the individual liberty they generate. This awareness would make us recognize not only the folly and presumptuousness of the modern and contemporary men who believe their institutional creation were close to perfection, but more importantly, to acknowledge that our constitutional systems are inherently flawed and in need of immediate and periodic repair due to the high degree of entropy they allow for. The second implication, which was so evident for the ancients as for the modern Republican thinkers like Machiavelli, is that the law is not necessarily a source of virtue, and that not all constitutional forms are virtuous enough to counteract natural and relentless tendencies. Consequently, what is legal is not necessarily virtuous, and what is corrupt is not necessarily illegal. Campaign finance and lobbying regulations, which legalize forms of bribery and undue influence, are an example of this. If we take as a premise that all constitutions and the laws they produce could tend to foster corruption, the relativity of the rule of law, which both neo-Republican and neoliberal thinkers argue is a mark of liberty, becomes evident. As I showed in my analysis of Machiavelli's work, corruption is the vehicle for oppression, and it originates not only in individuals, but also in the laws. And thus the rule of law must not be necessarily understood as a source of liberty. Because laws can be manipulated and used as tools of oppression, the rule of law appears not only as an inadequate measure of liberty, but also as an extremely problematic one, since it could actually tend to uphold and sustain domination instead of combating it. A third implication comes from qualifying political corruption as pertaining to rules, procedures, and institutions that affect the sociopolitical realm. There is an inevitable enlargement of the scope of the phenomenon. If the mark of political corruption is the advancement of individual or sectional interests against those of the majority, then we could think as being corrupt not only laws and policies that actively favor the wealthy, and consider as corrupting ideologies those that have these consequences when implemented, but also the negligence of law and policymakers to counteract oligarchic outcomes, passively letting the wealthy keep further enriching themselves. Because conceiving political corruption in terms of its systemic effects allows us to separate corruption from individual immoral disposition and its immediate tangible actions, ideologies such as neoliberalism, which has the effect of increasing socioeconomic inequality and thus the power of the wealthy, and governmental inaction, such as the lack of proper regulation of the financial system, which ultimately enabled the last economic global crisis and the massive transfer of wealth from the many to the few, could be conceived as forms of political corruption because they enable the further oligarchization of liberal democracy. So in terms of how we could attempt to measure systemic corruption, the only way to account for the drift into oligarchy would be to take into account the effects that the legal structure and governmental action have on society. And thus a corruption index should include, in addition to anti-corruption laws, number of prosecutions, and opinion polls, variables related to the outputs of law and policy, such as the degree of inequality, the gap between capital and labor, allocations of GDP among social classes, and regressive progressive taxation schemes. This data is not only already available, but seems better suited for undertaking a comparison among countries than solely relying on laws, court records, and individual perceptions of corruption, which are in themselves conditioned by the legal political culture. If one agrees that the minimal normative expectation of liberal democracies is that governments should advance the interests of the majority within constitutional safeguards, increasing income inequality and the relative immiseration of the majority of citizens would be a sign of corruption. However, this insight is yet to be properly analyzed in our juridical individualist conception of corruption, which prevents us from fully capturing its systemic nature and its effects on the exercise of individual liberties. Following Machiavelli's analysis, if corruption is reduced to individual illegal actions, the relentless process of political degradation and loss of liberty is obscured. Individual pursuit of interest is an inevitable feature in a free state. And so it is the degradation of the constitutional constraints on undue influence on government. While the former cannot be eliminated, the latter must be acknowledged and remedied to keep corruption at bay. So now I'm going to talk about Chile. I was not going to talk about this, but it happened, that the popular uprising started 3 weeks ago. So as a case of systemic corruption, okay, Chile is the poster child of neoliberal economics, the miracle, the oasis of stability in Latin America, the tiger of Latin America. There are many things that have been thrown at Chile because of the great economic indicators. So there's low inflation, low unemployment, economic freedom, the 18th freest country in the world, corruption, number 24, one of the most cleanest countries in the world. So when this happened, all the political elite were stunned. They couldn't understand what was happening. They argued that actually this was an uprising based on the success of the country, and they couldn't see that during these 30 years, from 1990 to today, in which Chile came back from a dictatorship, the income of the lower strata of society kept stable, only adjusting for a little bit of inflation, while the cost of living started to skyrocket. So, for example, we have the cost of living of Spain, but have the wages of Paraguay, one of the poorest countries in Latin America. So the middle class struggles and is hollowed out. So just for a number, an average Chilean spends 45% of their income in paying debts. So therefore, their way of life is being financed through debt, which is very expensive, because if you're poor, you have higher rates and you have to pay higher rates than the richest person, right? You have more money, you have a best credit. So in a way, the majority of the middle class that was supposedly created through neoliberal reforms and open markets is actually hollow, is precarious. So there's a sense of precarity in the population that sparked 1 month ago. So very briefly, for those who don't know the history, in 1973, so we had a socialist, the first socialist president in the world, elected in the ballot box, and greater equality was increased. There was a lot of pushback from the elites, and then the United States, through the CIA, funded a coup d'etat, and Pinochet came to power in 1973. He was advised by a group of scholars called the Chicago Boys. These right-wing politicians and economists who went to study in the Chicago school, the Hayek philosophy, so neoliberal economics, and they thought that Chile was the perfect laboratory for neoliberal policies. And they implemented these policies in a very rough manner, if you will. And poverty doubled, inequality doubled, tripled, but of course it was a dictatorship, so people just needed to consent. They were at gunpoint, basically. So it was the first time neoliberal policies were applied in the world. Then was Thatcher, and then was Reagan. Okay, so and this was because it was a dictatorship. People didn't know the economic numbers within and the misery that the Chilean population was suffering. When in 1990 Pinochet was overthrown by a plebiscite, there was a coalition between the right and the left to kind of stabilize democracy. So they didn't want to question the model. And of course, the Chicago Boys and the other people that were surrounding him, they're also constitutional scholars. So what they did is that they constitutionalized their neoliberal model in the Constitution. For example, one of the articles prohibits the state from engaging in any economic activity whatsoever without a supermajority in Congress to allow it. So therefore, expropriation is not part of the game in a way. So therefore, it's a very stable a country in order to invest. So there was a lot of investment. We are one of we have no tariffs. So there's a lot of consumer goods coming. So at the beginning, people understood that this was the kind of a middle class country was becoming a reality. However, this was proven wrong. So in order to and of course, the reaction of the neoliberal state, the oligarchic state, was brutal. So there are almost 200 people blind, at least from one eye, from the shooting of pellet bullets. And they're still ongoing. There's around 20 deaths. There are more than, I think, 180 cases of sexual violence. So it is widespread. And we're only a month in, and this is still going on. So the oligarchic state didn't care in a way. They said that people in the streets are just being paid by foreign infiltrators from Cuba. So we were going back to the 1970s and the threat of the communists. However, we have media today. So everybody was filming the police brutality and put it in social media. So now the hegemony of the media, the traditional media, which is owned by right-wing corporations, they were putting only the violence against property. It was 24/7 in CNN basically, but the police brutality was happening in social media. So people started to get enraged, and this happened. Why does it happen? Because the government increased that metro tariff 3%, which is nothing. Which is to say, how can this happen for something so small? The problem was that the fair evasion movement, that actually was recently copied in New York, it was heavily repressed by the police. So fair evasion, not paying the metro, is a violation. So basically you get a ticket. You have your ID, you get a ticket, you pay the ticket, that's fine. They cannot bring you to the precinct. So what the police were informed to do was actually to repress this, because they wanted people to pay and they didn't want this evasion mobilization to go out of hand. And this repression of the students, so these are 16, 17-year-olds, the brutal repression of them got all the families, grandfathers, grandmothers, uncles, everybody out, because everybody was enraged. And the repression of those peaceful mobilizations further increased the malcontent of the majority of people that were kind of demobilized and desensitized by neoliberalism, working 2-3 jobs to just make ends meet, just go out because this is kind of the end of the world. So in order to see a little bit what I'm talking about, to include these variables into the index of corruption. So if we look at inequality, Chile is the 20th most unequal country in the world. Then the share of wages versus profits is 30% for wages, 42% for corporate profits. Then you have the allocation of the GDP, just the tip of the iceberg. The richest 1% owns at least a third of the GDP. These are 100 people. And then taxes. The sales tax is 19%, which is the most regressive taxation, because all the poor and the people that basically eat their paycheck are paying this sales tax all the time. So the wealthy is that they cannot consume as much. So therefore, relatively to their salary, the poor and middle classes pay more in sales tax. Corporate tax is only 27%, and personal tax is the highest, is 35%. But then wages. The minimum wage is $447 a month. Then the median wage is $795 a month. But then the CEO wage in annually, because we don't know really monthly, is $130,000. A senator earns $31,000, $200,000. And of course, they don't pay taxes. They have other, transportation, all free stuff. And then the president is $196,000 a year. So do you see the gap between regular people and the median wage? It is a majority of people earns below $800 a month, which is nothing in a country in which it has the cost of living of Spain. So what happened is that sorry, it's a little bit off. As Ernesto Laclau would say, this kind of articulation of demands happened at the most macro of all levels. So first they wanted better pensions, to increase the minimum wage, to change the privatized, and this is another thing that I forgot to say, that because of the neoliberal reforms, everything that your life depends on is private. Everything. So you need to pay for everything. Everything has a price tag. So therefore, if everything increases and your salary doesn't, you struggle, because if you're sick, then you die, or you need to wait months for an underfunded public service. So therefore, all these different demands. So the students who have an incredible debt, the retirees who doesn't have enough money to retire, the people sick, people with disabilities, they all came together and realized that they needed a structural change, because you cannot put your finger on what was wrong. Everything is wrong. The system is wrong. So therefore, this is a mural in a street in Santiago. At the end of the third week, instead of specific demands, the demand was, we need to change the constitution. Okay? And what happened next is that the president at the beginning, he didn't want to change the constitution. He said, we're going to do some constitutional reforms. And at the end, he convoked all the leaders of the political parties who had nothing to do with the mobilizations, nothing at all. They were put in closed doors, and for around 10 hours of negotiations, they came out with an agreement. And the agreement is that there will be a plebiscite asking people if they want or not a new constitution, and what method they want. But that the method they impose is an assembly that has a supermajority of 2/3 to pass anything, which means that the right-wing third plus one will have a veto over anything that the 2/3 will put on the table, which is basically social rights. Because if you have social rights, for example, the social right to health, you would need to completely dismantle the private insurance system. And therefore, the right will oppose that. So now, these leaders who are the political elite are acting, even the left ones, the only people that did not, were not convoked were the communists. All of others were inside the negotiation. Even the new left that came out of the last 2011 protests, they were all together. And therefore you see kind of a clustering of the political elites vis-a-vis the grassroots, who are still mobilizing. So even after this agreement and everybody was shaking hands and having photographs and saying this is historic change, amazing, Chile new beginning, people still are marching today, and repression is still today, because people really want a say on what is going to be the next system. Because I think people understand that even though you can have a new constitution, the system of representative government, it is what it is in a way. And this is the system of representative government is going to corrupt in the long term anyway, because we just select virtuous leaders, but these leaders inevitably get co-opted by the powers that be. So therefore, in a way, at least in my own work, in the book that is coming out, I propose to constitutionalize popular power, to break away from the idea that because we are such a huge states, we cannot really have local power and local government. And I propose a network of primary assemblies as a way of constitutionalizing popular power in order to push back, to have a say. Because if as individuals we need to push back against power, this is very difficult. If you have ever gone to court, it's kind of the worst experience ever. So if you get, screwed by your boss or whatever, you need to go to court. Nobody's going to do it. Few people do. So therefore you don't fight back. But if you have an institution in which collectively you could fight back, this is more an opening for at least putting corruption at bay. Thank you.